When one plans a conference many months in advance and sets a date almost a year in advance, one isn't fully anticipating that it will snow on those very days that the conference occurs. So thanks for joining us last night and today. Let me just mention a few things. Obviously, we are starting late, in part because even AV audiovisual staff got delayed by the snow. So we are running, as I see it, we're basically going to start 40 minutes later. So if you think about the schedule and add 40 minutes to the schedule, that's where we're running. That puts us at an end at 6:40, unless Henk Ovink and I, on our last panel, cancel that panel. But I think we'll have some conversations in the end, and we'll see how that all works out. And for the stalwart people who will want to stay with us till 6:40 this evening, Henk Ovink and I and whoever else will be there. Even if it's just the two of us chairing that together for the two of us, we will be there. And then afterwards, even maybe before, yes, we will need lubrication. A few administrative details of what happens today. As it did last night, the conference is organized by panels, and the panels generally have 3 speakers, each of whom speaks for 20 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of questions, comments from audience members, and then another 15 minutes of moderated discussion by the moderator with the panelists. Last night we didn't actually do that. We privileged audience participation, appropriately so, and had a good discussion that way. We may try to be a little more strict on that plan today, but we'll see how that goes. But we get to audience immediately after the first hour of the discussion. There is one panel that has 2 people, speakers, rather than 3. Obviously, that's 40 minutes of direct presentation. There are 2 coffee breaks, and there is a break, and there is coffee. There is also lunch. I believe we have lunch boxes that are moderately priced and available for the period of lunch, which had been scheduled for 12 to 1, and now will be 12:40 to 1:40. So without further ado, we'll begin. I have my first 15 minutes or so. I may run slightly on unless I actually pull myself off as the timekeeper. But in any event, let's begin today's program. As I said yesterday at the beginning, welcoming all of you, in this digital age, physical public space still matters. It turns out that revolutions still derive some of their juice from people gathering together in one space, proximate to each other and proximate to structures of power. That's the story, of course, of Tahrir Square, of Zuccotti Park, adding their narratives to the pages of recorded history. Physical public space has multiple ambitions and capabilities. Indeed, we ask a lot of it. We ask for enjoyment, casual and recreational activities. We ask for equality, enjoyment for those who can't as easily buy enjoyment. We ask for democracy and for beauty, symbolism, environmental benefits. So I want to throw a frisbee. I want to have a picnic with my family and friends. I want to read a book or occupy or skateboard or sleep and the many other activities, not all of which are compatible with one another. Indeed, multiple demands placed on public space have led to conflicting judgments about its performance. Depending on who you ask, public space is doing a great job or a terrible job. Recent park examples drawn even from what we saw last night in New York are very illustrative. Central Park, Brooklyn Bridge Park, the High Line, all together for some suggest a park renaissance. For others, they suggest unequal privilege in park design and park operation. Don Mitchell, the scholar, entitles an article, "The End of Public Space," putting a question mark on it, but of course the implication is that public space has ended. The pluralism of public space, with its multiple users, multiple providers, private owners, public owners, multiple intermediaries, designers, planners, users, and multiple analysts, theorists, behavioralists, can be overwhelming. Those interested in public space often speak past each other, a veritable modern-day Tower of Babel. There is the language of the designers, the language of theorists, the language of the environmental determinists, the language of the do-it-yourselfers, the language of the activists, the language of private owners and managers, the language of government officials. We, all of us in the public space area, often speak past each other. Did Henri Lefebvre ever read William H. White, or vice versa? As abundant as it is, the commentary stays remarkably siloed rather than porous and dispersed in ways that miss opportunities for new knowledge. Luckily, I don't have all the answers. I say luckily because I assembled a wonderful, marvelous group of speakers and moderators to provide them. But of course, they can't provide all of them either. I entitled my brief presentation this morning, Composing Public Space, because public space is truly composed, but not by one composer. Who and what puts the public in public space? What puts the ape in apricot? What makes the muskrat guard his musk? Sang Bert Lahr, the Cowardly Lion, in The Wizard of Oz. And his answer was courage. We need a bit of courage, I think, and directness in discussing public space. So let me propose 3 ideas or propositions or inquiries to start us off this morning. My first proposition: should there be a human right to public space? A human right rises axiomatically, inherently, and inalienably from the very fact of being human. We are a rights-driven, some would argue rights-obsessed world, with too many rights promised and too few delivered. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly, which articulates many rights, with many of them unrealized. Modern constitutions and legislation worldwide declare a right to housing, a right to food, a right to clean air, even a right to the city, all of which have been disappointed by the reality of performance. At least to me, however, it is not unimaginable to embed a right to public space in our thinking, aspirations, and ethical stance, if not in our laws. To some degree, it's already baked into the right to the city idea. Lefebvre refers to a transformed and renewed access to urban life. Harvey talks about it as a collective rather than individual right. It's already implied in many constitutions worldwide. In our United States Constitution, the freedom of speech, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to petition, all imply rights to be exercised somewhere, perhaps indeed in public space. And constitutional lawyers argue over the public forum doctrine, the public forum being a public space, and how government may or may not impose restrictions, including so-called time, place, or manner restrictions. So a right to public space is not unimaginable. What would the right do for people? What would it guarantee? The right to enjoy a space, to skateboard next to an older book reader who doesn't want that skateboarder next to him or her, to speak, to assemble, to petition, to occupy. Where would indeed one exercise such rights? Because now we have to talk about specific public space. Occupy occupations worldwide were very instructive about the ambiguities in this regard. Occupy Wall Street itself had an incredibly ambiguous occupation. For many, it was an irony that instead of choosing City Hall Park, a publicly owned park, it chose instead a privately owned space several blocks to the south. Because, as it turned out, it had more rights in the privately owned space than it would have in a city-owned park. And there were similar controversies worldwide, whether it was outside of St. Peter's in London or the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston, or with many of the Occupy occupations, which all ended up, to some degree, in court somewhere, arguing about what was the rights of the occupiers compared to the rights of the owner of the space, sometimes public owner, sometimes private owner. And by the way, what about private property? Interestingly, there are cases in the United States where even Private owners of property have a legal obligation to allow some sorts of activities that they might otherwise not want. The Pruneyard case, a United States Supreme Court case, recounts how California's state constitution requires owners of malls, which are private property, to allow individuals who are shopping in the mall to also petition if they like, or even people not shopping to petition, as long as the mall is open to the public. So, if there were a right to public space, would that suggest that government has an obligation to provide the funding necessary to make the right more than an unfulfilled goal? Could individuals sue to enforce the right? And what's a right, after all, without a remedy, even as we have many rights without remedies worldwide? No matter what, how might we determine whether the right to public space has been fulfilled? What metrics or norms would we use? By quantity, square foot per capita? By accessibility, a space within a 10-minute radius or walk? By public investment, dollars per capita? Perhaps by quality of outcome, more difficult to measure. And indeed, if we drill down on what we're ultimately concerned about, which is quality of outcome, not just nature of input, what about equality of public space provision? There's a very interesting case called Beale versus Lindsay. It's an instructive case. Gertrude Beale, other African American or Puerto Rican residents, and an association called Bronx Citizens for a Cleaner Park brought suit against the mayor of New York, Beale versus Lindsay, Mayor Lindsay at the time, complaining about unequal treatment of the park they used compared with other parks. Here's what the judge said in the opinion. Quote, "The maintenance of Crotona Park is almost non-existent. What was once one of the major parks in the city is now a mass of broken glass and litter strewn about. Most of the benches and fences are broken and non-usable. Numerous abandoned automobiles often litter the roads running through the park for days. Little or no attempt has been made to clean up the park, despite numerous requests by residents of the community. On the contrary, Van Cortlandt Park, Pelham Bay Park, and Bronx Park are kept in near spotless condition. During warm weather seasons, numerous park personnel can be seen removing the litter created by weekend crowds. Within a couple of days, these parks are spotless." So we have one bad park, 3 good parks. The court was very sympathetic, stating, quote, "While the availability of other parks, these other 3, is a factor worthy of consideration, it is not a complete answer, particularly to a complaint brought by citizens who may lack the means to transport themselves and their families to distant parks. Still," concluded the court, "we will not guarantee equal results." Quote, "The city has satisfied its constitutional obligations by equal input, even though, because of conditions for which it is not responsible, it has not achieved the equal results it desires. How much further to go beyond equal effort in order to redeem Crotona Park is a matter of municipal policy, not of constitutional command." To be clear, however, the absence of law, constitutional or otherwise, need not deter any of us in the public space field from seeing opportunities in the intellectual framing or assertion of a human right to public space. Here's a second proposition. Do we lack adequate knowledge about how to create public space or good public space? And depending on whom you speak with, public space is under-researched, over-researched, or both. We certainly know a lot, but it is siloed knowledge, siloed by disciplinary and professional field origins, methodological approaches, professions and professional cultures, attitudes, foundational theories, public space typologies, and oh, did I mention attitude? Let's briefly review some of these prominent schools, all of which have their own departments and cliques dealing with public space. There is the environmental determinism, behavioral, evidence-based school, arguing that public spaces can be studied, arranged and programmed to produce desirable outcomes for users. Observe, ask, do, in that order. It's a version with mediation to some degree of the user knows best. Its faculty includes such individuals as, perhaps most prominently, William H. White, Jan Gehl, Claire Cooper Marcus, Amanda Burden, and more generally, Kevin Lynch, Jane Jacobs, Robert Gutman, and of course the ultimate practitioners of the behavioral school are retail mall experts who earn their living by figuring out and influencing behavior. William H. White's wonderful, pithy book and film on the social life of small urban spaces is a doctor's prescription redeemable at the public space pharmacy. He had his ideas based on observation of movable chairs. His, by the way, science behind why movable chairs are so important is people tend to sit most where there are places to sit. He also suggested food, trees, water, sun, all based on close observation of spaces, but then the leap to correlation. Indeed, correlation to behavior. And for some, all of this is a bit pat in the end. Decades ago, Berkeley professor Carl Sauer criticized the whole behavioral approach. Culture creates the landscape, not the other way around, he argued in The Morphology of Landscape. White might respond, I look first, then act. And indeed, the White school has been quite influential. And I did set up chairs in this room in a particular way, by the way, to foster more conversation rather than less with audience and speakers. Recently, there are some advocating on behalf of designing public space for protest, active democratic engagement space, a sort of speaker's corner on every corner. I personally am a bit skeptical of this kind of designed protest space, especially for protest that's meant to be transgressive at times. It seems to me a well-tended, well-designed, welcoming space for transgression may not exactly do the trick. Another school, the Professional Designer School, trained design professionals within the departments themselves, literally, architects, landscape architects, et cetera, who use design thinking and methods to generate output. And indeed, a simple recitation of recent chairs and professors in our own landscape architecture department here at Harvard, from Pete Walker to Michael Van Valkenburg to George Hargraves to Martha Schwartz, would be a fine list of people representing the trained design professional category. Understandably, designers privilege form, given their specific training and role. The critique of designers, and especially those that attract the label high design, placed as a pejorative on them by non-designers, by the way, and specific non-designers, the critique is that the designer's form doesn't always privilege or adequately privilege the user or evidence-based knowledge about users. And indeed, that's why high design is wielded as a pejorative label. There is Philip Johnson's story about Mies van der Rohe's reaction when he saw people sitting on the ledges in his Seagram Plaza. Mies was surprised, Johnson reported, because Mies never considered or worried about whether or not people would sit in his plaza. Another school is the informal, temporary, do-it-yourself school that eschews the professional observer, the behavioralist, or the professional designer as mediating forces at all. This school questions whether professionals and intentionality ever create public space, or better public space, than that created by the public, the counterpublics, the untrained, the do-it-yourselfers. Users know best, especially when they actively engage with a space. And this school offers a significant critique of the previous schools I described. Then there's the theorist school, Lefebvre, Benjamin, Habermas, Mitchell, Castells, and Soja, to name a few. Oh, and did I mention Lefebvre? Can theories be instrumentalized in physical terms? Need they be? How about a studio taught at a design school that asks students to design a Lefebvrean space? How different would it look from a Habermasian or Benjamin space? Often, the theorist's complex translated words become triggering metaphors for actual design the millefeuille, for example, and when one has to wonder whether or not that's even within the intention of the theorist. The typological school, the school that divides and studies specific physical categories of space. Public space typologies too easily divide rather than unite or build public space knowledge. And I could easily plead guilty to that. I'm the POPs expert, after all, privately owned public space. And there are parks experts and sidewalk experts and street experts and pop-up experts. Annette Kim, Anastasia Lukaido-Sideris, Renya Ehrenfeucht, Mitchell Dunier, Canada's Bromley, all of them proudly proclaim themselves sidewalk experts. And they are because they've all written books about sidewalks, not that they haven't written about other things. And I am truly a POPs expert. But when I'm asked from time to time, is a mall a privately owned public space? Well, yes, of course it is. Of course it is. I used the phrase privately owned public space as a descriptive to spotlight what I saw as the key tension inherent in the law that had created a certain category of space. Incidentally, before I employed this phrase, they had been called popularly public open spaces, whereas I saw the tension as privately owned. We should all talk more, of course, because it is indeed all public space. And then there's the environmental school. Public spaces, especially the green ones, are part of a system, an ecosystem that can serve many environmental ends. From the biophilic design of Stephen Kellert to the ecologies of Stuart Pickett and Richard Foreman, to landscape and ecological urbanism, Waldheim and Mustafavi come to mind, our colleagues here at school. This is very much in the water. There's a pragmatic need now fueling this school because we need places that can indeed hold water. Well, with all of these schools, what about future research? There's a lot still that can be researched, even as we may be, in some areas, over-researched, we're also under. What do we expect of our public spaces? What do we mean by success of public space? How do we measure it? Do we really know what works and doesn't work for the multiple publics? What is the effect of public space in this digital age with digital? What about surveillance that turns our public spaces into something perhaps to avoid? At a time of frightening technological advances, how do we ensure privacy in public space? How can we create political constituencies rather than bringing lawsuits for equal access? The third proposition, as I come to a close, is ownership destiny? Is the identity of the owner or steward or manager of public space outcome determinative in terms of its use? Are privatizations and commercializations of public space the savior or the devil for the future of public space? I personally find this public versus private trope less than fully illuminating. I remember a young letter writer who wrote to then Mayor Giuliani in New York years ago after literally millions of dollars had been spent improving City Hall Park. And that young letter writer complained about no longer being able to pursue certain recreational activities in the newly prettified City Hall Park post tens of millions of dollars. That was a public owner suddenly restricting use in a way unanticipated. Is it really smart to oppose all private activities in public space, even when we know that many of them may indeed enliven public space activities? And given that so many of our spaces are victims, pragmatically, of underinvestment in capital and maintenance caused by budgetary pressures that demand money being spent on other activities, should we be so doctrinaire? On the other hand, Michael Sandel, the political scientist, reminds us that not everything should be for sale. And why take the heat off the public sector to spend money as it should on public space? My sense is to avoid purists on any side of this matter. So Yahoo tells us, I guess, what, that place matters? allegedly, as of this June, everybody will no longer be able to telecommute, and you all came here and we're not live streaming today. And I think in this building, we all agree and we all know there's something magical and socially crucial about providing places where people may physically gather. Physical is different. Everyone and everything makes public space. That's what makes it so exciting and so out of control and so open finally to engagement by anyone. There is vast empowerment associated with public space. So let's think comprehensively. After all, no public space is an island. Let's celebrate the hybridities of public space. Indeed, there's money to be garnered from infrastructure projects that can also be public space projects. And as the great philosopher and bank robber Willie Sutton once reminded everyone, I rob banks because that's where the money is. So greater constituencies, greater political support, greater financial support. This is a call to arms for scholars, practitioners, activists, everyone. Let's get our arms and our hands dirty. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Neil Brenner. I teach urban theory here at the GSD, and this first panel has what, for me anyway, is a very provocative title, How Relevant is Theory? Since I teach urban theory, I think theory is relevant to everything. So we have three speakers on this panel. First, Adrian Blackwell of Waterloo, and also visiting professor at the GSD. And then we will hear from John Parkinson of Warwick, and then we'll hear from Greg Smith-Simon of Brooklyn College, CUNY. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Adrian.
Sorry, I'm not sure how this timer works here. Got timer. Start. No? Okay, good. I've got it. Thanks, Gerald. Thanks a lot, Gerald, for inviting me to speak at this conference. The title of my talk is The Paradoxical Structure of Public Space. How do I move forward here? Okay. What do we mean when we say the words public space? Public space has been an important concept for designers since at least the 19th century. One way that modern architects, landscape architects, and urbanists have brought meaning to their labor has been to work for a public rather than the private interests of powerful individuals. But we always seem to mean different things when we use the words public space. So it often seems as if the concept itself is insufficiently precise. A square is a public space, but how public are heavily controlled sites such as Tiananmen Square in Beijing or Red Square in Moscow, where spontaneous gatherings are forbidden? A mall is a public space that may provide essential and necessary space for gathering and community services, but it is privately controlled and policed. These contradictions abound in public spaces, so much so that one strategy might be to give up on the concept entirely. A second strategy, which I'd like to adopt here, would be to integrate this apparent imprecision into the concept itself, positing that rather than ambiguity, public space is endowed with a paradoxical structure. It is my contention that not only should we understand the concept of public space as paradoxical, but that this is exactly what defines public space as such. Any concrete public space is necessarily a discursive space, and the terms of a discourse are always differences and disagreements. A paradox is the limit form of this disagreement, and public space is the space between terms of a paradox. What makes a space public are the debates we have over its meanings and functions. Theory is therefore crucial to public spaces because each is constructed through both physical material processes and the theories and ideologies that conflict in its design, construction, and ongoing use. Public space is a critique of neoliberalism. If Hannah Arendt argued in the 1950s that the tyranny of society had destroyed the public, neoliberalism in turn has destroyed society and made critical discussions of public space relevant once again. Neoliberalism's disregard for public space and its relentless move to privatize public institutions appears perfectly rational according to the logic of the market. As Boris Groys states in the Communist Postscript, there are no discursive contradictions under capitalist modes of governance. because number, not language, is the final arbiter of all questions. Arendt concurs, claiming that money as the measure of virtue has destroyed the public by rendering the innumerable and unquantifiable differences between people equivalent. If this was true in the 1950s, then it should be clear after 40 years of marketization, financialization, and private indebtedness that what we have seen since the 1970s has only made the concept of the public more difficult to even imagine. The disappearance of public space under neoliberalism has had concrete effects in the spaces of the city as well. In the mid-20th century, public parks and squares were built throughout North America, broadly provided for all citizens. Postmodern urban design that emerged with neoliberalism in the 1970s criticized these spaces as overscaled and abstract, instead revalorized the streets and squares of the traditional city. However, this emphasis on walkability and street life was in most cases confined to small, limited areas of redevelopment, contributing to larger processes of gentrification, while rendering this uneven development difficult to see. In The Urban Sensorium, Kanishka Gunawardena has made a powerful argument for the ideological nature of space, claiming that the immersive aesthetics of urban space make it a powerful ideological tool. We simply can't deny what we feel. The very selective gentrification of public spaces over the past 40 years has been a powerful argument in favor of neoliberalism, presenting the city as a smooth and coherent space, even as its social polarization deepens. One illustration of this phenomena is Toronto's Urban Design Handbook of 1997. Its guidelines emphasize the continuity and seamlessness of different buildings as the primary objective of public space design. All buildings should align, meeting common setbacks and eave lines. These principles, developed to give the city a sense of coherence, also cover over the social contradictions of the city. Sociologist David Holchansky and the Center for Urban and Community Studies at the University of Toronto have mapped the changing social patterns of the city and discovered a significant increase in social and economic polarization between the mid-20th century and neoliberalism. In the 1960s, the average incomes of the city's downtown were a little below average. The north central city was above average, and most of the western and eastern suburbs were slightly above average income, with pockets of wealthy neighborhoods. In 2000, the average tracts have all but disappeared, and most cities live in a U-shaped band of below average income running from the northwest to the core and out to the northeast. The city's wealth has been further consolidated in the center of the city. These maps illustrate very clearly the way in which the economic polarization that has occurred since the 1970s has had significant effects on urban space, clearly indicating that the urban designs of neoliberalism, which claim to have produced more livable public spaces, have in fact produced a geography of severe inequality. The occupation and design of public space. In the context of its absence, public space has returned as something worth talking about. The most effective recent resistances to neoliberalism have contested the meanings of specific spaces, whether in Tahrir Square in Egypt, Puerta del Sol in Madrid, Zuccotti Park in New York, or Syntagma Square in Athens. These occupations have shattered the seamlessness of public spaces in order to illustrate their paradoxical natures. These spaces were used for traffic, not people, spaces for commerce, corporate lunches, or state spectacle, rather than political action. The protests involved an act of both physical and theoretical appropriation. People take over space, but in the process they rename and reinscribe its functions and meanings, forcing the contradictions that lie hidden beneath their smooth everyday operations out into the light of day. In these cases, public space is produced through action as an event. So if the paradox of public space is something that can be activated through political protest, regardless of how well designed a space might or might not be, then what can designers do to make space public? As Rosalind Deutsch argues in her essay, Uneven Development, it is necessary to understand public space as a space of conflict between different positions, as a paradoxical space in which opposing arguments can play themselves out. Of course, these matters of concern manifest themselves in many forms, so that the rest of this paper will illustrate the structural paradox of public space using recent experiments in the city of Toronto. One to illustrate each of the following oppositions: representation and presentation, people and things, and the city and urbanization. Presentation, representation, Nathan Phillips Square. One of the fundamental paradoxes of public space is that it is at once a space for the representation of state power and a space for the pure presentation in which people assemble to challenge the power of government. The 2007 international competition to redesign Toronto City Hall Square was won by Plant Architect Inc., Shore Tilby Irwin and Partners, Peter Lindsay Shout Landscape Architect, and Adrian Blackwell Urban Projects. Our design was based on a careful analysis of the original 1967 project by Finnish architect Viljo Revel. Revel won the competition with a highly symbolic and functional monument to democracy. The project consists of a large public square designed for public events, surrounded by a colonnade with a raised walkway on top. To the north of the square is a large podium containing the building department, a library, and gallery on the ground floor, and councillors' offices on the second. Floating above the podium, like a flying saucer, is the council chamber, and two curved towers that rise from either side of it, mimicking the theatrical form of the chamber within urban space. Following Richard Sennett's provocative 1998 essay, The Spaces of Democracy, our team argued that the two complementary spaces of Athenian democracy were necessary poles of the democratic process: an open, inclusive space of familiar and sociable interaction, the agora, and a focused space of decision-making, which allowed for visibility and audibility, the pnyx. In this dialectic, Revel's scheme renders the square itself as an agora by adding a stoa on four sides, and makes the pnyx publicly visible as a space of deliberation floating above the square. But unlike Athenian democracy, its modern form is representational, and as a result, citizens do not participate directly in decision-making in the pnyx. As if in acknowledgement of this fact, Revel made the roofs of the stoa and the podium accessible as balconies, creating a situation of overlook and turning the agora into a self-consciously theatrical space, a space of pure presentation. In this way, the square embodies the paradoxically open and focused structure of public space that Sennett describes. The revitalization was based on four strategic ideas designed to strengthen this original conception and to render it more politically effective. First, the square within the stoa needed to be empty of later incursions, such as the postmodern Peace Garden, in order to create a radical openness for events. Second, the spaces outside the stoa were designed for smaller gatherings beneath the shade of a healthier new tree canopy. These smaller spaces were understood as counter-public spaces in the senses that Nancy Fraser and Michael Warner give this word. Third, the stoa and podium have been strengthened as thresholds between these two distinct forms of space, making a much more pleasant space of occupation on two levels. Finally, the new and renovated architecture is designed to connect the stoa balcony to the square, so that the new Peace Garden, restaurant, and information pavilions all incorporate stairs and sometimes elevators. We see the strengthening of this three-part structure of open interior, intimate perimeter, and the threshold between them as a structure to activate the political potential of the original space, producing a space in which citizens can present themselves in the face of the self-representation of the state. Okay, people and things, Black Creek Community Farm. As Bruno Latour points out in From Realpolitik to Dingpolitik, or How to Make Things Public, discourses of public space have for too long focused primarily on the organization of people and their forms of assembly, forgetting in the process the non-human matters of concern that people gather to debate. In response, he questions how both people and things can assemble in one space. The urban food movement engages this paradox. In the last decade, Toronto's non-governmental food advocates have gained in strength and experimental energy. Dutoit Alsop Hillier, a firm of architects, landscape architects, and planners, recently designed two new sites for the distribution of sustainable food. The Evergreen Brickworks and Artscapes Witchwood Barns both exemplify a new mode of public space making, combining farmers markets, park space, playgrounds, and other programs, such as artist studios in one case and office space for nonprofits in the other. However, both of these projects are located in proximity to central, wealthy city neighborhoods, and neither problematizes the fact that sustainable and ecologically responsible food production is expensive and therefore not available to low-income people. Other organizations, such as FoodShare and The Stop, focus on this paradox more directly. FoodShare provides affordable food in low-income suburbs through mobile markets and a school lunch program, while The Stop is firmly embedded in a low-income midtown neighborhood, running a soup kitchen, community garden, and home food distribution program as anti-poverty action. One of the most promising new public spaces in the city is the Black Creek Community Farm, located in the city's northern edge, but well within the contiguous urbanization of the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. The farm is surrounded by high-rise apartments and public housing projects in Jane Finch, Toronto's most notorious low-income neighborhood. The project is initiated by Everdale, an organic farm located in the greenbelt surrounding the GTA. But it is an exercise in assembling a coalition of actors with the power to produce a truly innovative public space. These include the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, who has leased Everdale the land on the edge of the city, African Food Basket, Food Share, Fresh City Farms, an urban farm in Downsview Park, and a coalition of academics and food activists at nearby York University and at Ryerson downtown. Together, this team has designed a public space in a dense, low-income neighborhood far from the city center that practices sustainable agriculture, provides youth education and employment, and affordable, healthy food. The project is a great example of urban political ecology, thinking about ecological processes while including humans within them and confronting the paradox of sustainability and affordability head-on. Through its careful assemblage of local partners at different scales, with diverse perspectives and knowledge, the project is able to combine things, plants, animals, buildings, rivers, and institutions, and people together in a single public space in ways that the autonomous plans of designers are rarely able to do. Okay, this is the final example. City urbanization, tower renewal. In his recent book, The Possibility of an Absolute Architecture, Pier Vittorio Aureli claims that the concepts of city and urbanization should be seen as opposing conceptions of urban space. He makes his argument by returning to the classical origins of these two ideas in the Greek polis and the Roman urbs. The Greek-walled polis is the original site of politics. Aureli claims that the city limit is the precondition for politics. The urbs, on the other hand, is designed as a camp that is infinitely repeatable across a territory. It is by definition unbounded. Aureli argues that the definitive conflict between these two conceptions can be seen under capitalism, where the city and politics have been eclipsed by economics and urbanization. Realizing that the city can never be recuperated, Aureli argues for architecture as a bounded form that can resist urbanization through its articulation of limits, rendering the paradox of politics and economy visible in its opposition to the city. While Aureli's statement of the problem is compelling, the claims he makes for resistance seem less definitive. One of the most interesting recent urban projects in Toronto is tower renewal. The proposal was generated at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design by a graduate student named Graham Stewart. After graduation, he continued the project with ERA Architects and the City of Toronto's Planning Department. The proposal begins from a series of observations about the city. First, Toronto has more buildings over 10 stories than any city in North America except New York. Second, these towers are distributed evenly so that most of them are located in suburban neighborhoods. Third, these buildings are well located on arterial roads in proximity to both existing and proposed transit corridors. Fourth, despite their locations, their urban forms do little to define the streets they sit on or provide much needed ground level programs. Finally, these buildings are poorly insulated, so much so that each apartment leaks more energy than a typical mid-century bungalow. Based on these observations, Tower Renewal argues that these buildings constitute an incredible resource of housing that simply needs to be better insulated, while its sites need to be redesigned to relate better to streets and open spaces, such as ravines, in order to substantively improve the condition of many of the city's lowest income neighborhoods. Learning from the hard work of activists and critical geographers, this proposal participated in a Copernican revolution in the local design community and the general public's understanding of the city of Toronto. Until then, Toronto had really been understood as a walkable city of neighborhoods. Suddenly, there was a vision that could more adequately account for the globalized and impoverished neoliberal city. Tower Renewal holds up two sides of the paradox of city urbanization. Unlike downtown gentrification projects, which offer the sophist image of coherence in the face of the city's actual splintering, or Aureli's inverted vision of resistant architecture, Tower Renewal both illustrates and preserves the city's paradoxical form and intervenes in it to improve the lives of those who live in Toronto's aging high-rise buildings. The paradoxical structure of public space. Public space is nothing but the spatial articulation of a paradoxical reality. It exists only as an opposition between two true but opposing ideas. In this sense, public space is always political and evental. Jacques Rancière preserves the name politics for that moment when a wrong is articulated and that part of society that has been given no part in its governance suddenly appears. Like Arendt, Rancière sees politics as an absolutely contingent event that occurs when strangers appear together and use speech to confront a common matter of concern. The paradox that is constitutive of public space marks the poles of this concern. Without its inscription in the very matter of space itself, there is no such thing as public space.
I'm afraid this is going to be a bit of a change of gear. I'm a political theorist, and political theorists love words. There's not going to be quite so much in the way of illustration here, and for that, my apologies. I'm going to bombard you a little bit. I'm going to try to explore how public space looks to a political theorist coming from a very mainstream political science, liberal perspective. I understand, of course, that that's just one perspective, but I want to use this to highlight what for me are some of the interesting contrasts in the way that the concept public space is used and could be used, partly by my discipline, but also by some of the other disciplines here. But I'm going to start you off with some very complex philosophy by two late lamented American philosophers, Jim Henson and Frank Oz. I want you to imagine that you're 4 years old, maybe 5. You're sitting down in front of the television, and Sesame Street has come on. And in amongst all the Fozzie Bear and Cookie Monster, you get to one of my favorite parts, which is, I want you to imagine the song going in your head. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is kind of the same. I'm going to put up 4 pictures. I'd like you to imagine yourself in that position. You're the 4-year-old sitting there in front of the, one of these things is not like the other. Which one is it? Which one's the odd one out? Try and react just straight away. Think which one of these is the odd one out. And then I'm going to ask you to indicate what your choice was. Which one's the odd one out? How many choose top right? How many choose top left? Bottom right? Bottom left? Interesting. You fell into my cunning trap. My choice, top right. And I'm going to try and explain to you why relatively quickly. Now, if I reset this clock, I will keep track of my time. What I'm going to argue is that democracy in particular requires very, very particular approaches to public space, that not any public space will do. When we're thinking politically, there are very specific kinds of performance that democracy requires be performed, and that certain spatial forms support those practices and limit the ability to perform other kinds of things. But that common definitions of public space, ones focused around openness, accessibility, and so forth, are not sensitive to those needs, not sensitive to the tensions we find in real space, and thus support practices which limit democratic performance. Now, I want to be clear about this. I'm not claiming that a lot of the writing on public space is not aware of the problems, is not aware of the tensions, is not aware of the fact that certain kinds of performance cannot be performed or are limited in certain kinds of space. What I'm claiming is something more narrow. It's that particular theoretical approaches rob branches of the literature of the ability to convincingly challenge those limitations, can rob people of the ability to critique effectively. And this is partly to do with the fact that I'm a liberal theorist, but the very concepts of public and private are liberal concepts. I want to play around with that a little bit. So, standard definition. Open, accessible. Open access of people, practices, relative freedom of activity, and implying what's called a negative freedom. Freedom from the control of others, as opposed to a positive freedom in Isaiah Berlin's classic discussion, which is freedom to do something, an empowerment to do a particular form. But, standardly, these kinds of freedoms conflict. The freedom of the skateboarder to go charging around like that can conflict with the freedom of the slightly slower gentleman to get around safely without having his hip broken by the oncoming skateboarder. So we need a system of freedoms, in the words of John Rawls, that is consistent with a like freedom for all. This does not mean anything goes. Freedom on these terms is negotiation. The sorting out of conflicting freedoms so that we all have the ability to exercise the maximum possible consistent with a like freedom for all, an equal freedom, not just individual go for it kind of ideas of freedom. The other major trope we find is this idea that public space is characterized by unscripted encounters with strangers, and we find this right across the literature on public space. Kim Dovey, Margaret Cohn, Margaret Laughland, Ali Madanipour, and so forth. Don Mitchell mentioned before. And in part this is because of the roots of a lot of the literature on public space in classical sociology and classical urban sociology, particularly starting with Georg Simmel, looking at the journey from the village or the rural environment into the city and noticing the changes in the way that people interact with one another. The fact that in a small community you know each other, you have rules, you have norms, you have community, you have Gemeinschaft, and then you move into the city and find that a bunch of strangers now need a different set of rules, a different set of norms in order to operate together. And so the marker of publicness in this kind of work is that you cannot control who you encounter, and that produces certain kinds of behaviors, but produces responses from landowners and so forth who then want to control the kinds of behaviors that are useful to them in a more marketized environment and so forth. And so there's a lot of critique of, as a result, the controls that markets, as we heard from Adrian, then impose on otherwise free people and stop them from engaging in this relatively unscripted, controlled way. Let me now try and contrast that with a very standard political account. And if you look at this politically, from a political science, liberal point of view, public space can mean or the public indeed can mean four very different things. We tend to start with the public as a noun, rather than the public as a thing, as an adjective, and tend to think of demoi, groups of people, rather than demos, a single entity, counter-publics, as well as the public authorities. And we then think about the way in which those people make claims on each other, how they negotiate these conflicting desires that they might have, the conflicting freedoms they might have. And they might make claims on collective resources, air, water, and so forth, the public goods, infrastructure, and so forth. We might think about things that have common impact. So using the language of economics for a moment, think about externalities, which are the spillover impacts that my behavior might have. So standardly, the built environment itself is public space here. The built environment has a big impact on the amount of light and air and the quality of that light and air that I get. And so private behaviour, privately owned buildings are automatically part of public space when they have those kinds of impacts. And then we think about the public sphere. Two broad kinds of approaches come up here. We can either sort of think of a standard liberal one as being that space in which we resolve conflicting preferences, resolve the arguments between each other, or a more Republican, I'm using these terms in sort of classic philosophical ways rather than sort of the common discourse, liberal versus Republican kind of ways, of discovering a common good. So there are four distinct ways in which we would think about public space. An important point of all this is that a given space, a given physical site might be public in 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those ways and still be public. So the idea that there's some kind of, that public space is paradoxical, for me is, well, that's perfectly natural, of course, because there are 4 different kinds of ways of thinking about what public is. The idea of privately owned public space is not a particularly troubling idea, because public can mean 4 different things. And that's not terribly difficult once we get our heads around that. Well, let's think about, okay, specifically what kinds of space does politics require? What does democracy require? I found this sign yesterday. It just tickled me. I'm so angry. I made a sign. Yeah. I'm symbolizing. I'm signifying my anger. And there are a variety of roles that we play here. We represent ourselves as demo. We represent ourselves as claim makers. We make statements about ourselves as citizen. I am a rights holder. I am a claim maker. I am someone who has a right to make these claims upon you, upon the collective in some way. And I should be treated with dignity for doing so. But that role is very, very different from my role as consumer, shopper, moviegoer, going to the game, or my role as player, my role as dog walker, my role as child entertainer, which is my main role on the weekends. We play very different kinds of roles. And what I'm going to argue is that those different roles have different spatial requirements, and when we're thinking politically, there are some very specific ones. And I'm going to walk through them quickly now. The first one I call narrative space. And narrative space has almost limitless requirements. Narrative space is called into being whenever people gather together to talk politically. So in this kind of space, might be around the kitchen table. It might be in a bar. It might be here, in this room. It might be on the bus. In Switzerland, I have friends who say this kind of space exists on the train, especially the route between Zurich and Bern, when you've got the public sphere and the formal and the informal all gathering together, commuting home, and discussions breaking out on the train between ministers and staffers and other members of the public. It tends to be ritualized, proceduralized when it's an unsafe topic, but what counts as an unsafe topic varies from place to place. You know, I live in Britain, I'm a New Zealander, but I live in Britain, and it's very noticeable to me that the category of unsafe topic is an extremely expansive one in Britain. The safe topics are the weather, and that's about it. In New Zealand, it's a little bit more expansive. In Australia, it's, pretty much anything goes. No worries, mate. Well, up to a point, actually. But hey. So what counts as safe? What counts as, and who counts as a stranger is itself culturally determined and will be limited. So what counts as narrative space will vary from place to place. We ought not to think that this is a universal. It's not. But narrative space is very distinct from claim-making space, and I want to emphasize this. Claim-making space is when people narrate and tell stories about their experiences, but there's a follow-up, and the follow-up is, and something ought to be done about this. It's when we tell a story about, oh, my mum, she had a terrible experience when she went off to the hospital. It was appalling the way she treated her. Isn't it terrible that that hospital is so bad? What ought to be done about that? We ought to get together. We ought to make a difference. And when public claim making is the requirement, then different priorities kick in, different demands kick in. First demand, visibility. It's got to be visible to other members of the public. It's got to be visible to other members of the demos, particularly attentive publics, and by that I mean media, interest groups, and so forth. You need to do it in such a way as to enhance the dignity of the claim makers. The claim makers themselves are making a status claim, they're making an identity claim. It's to encourage others to see that this is a claim worth making. People like you think this. Come, join us. People like you are being heard. Come and add your voice. It's partly about conveying reasonableness sometimes, but it's also about emphasizing the justice of a claim. And the third thing is about eyeballing the powerful. You have to feel listened to. You have to feel as though your claim has been delivered to those who can make a difference. If you feel as though you're not engaging, then shift site. If you feel as though you're not being listened to, people shift tactics. So again, this is not just about saying something, it's about getting a sense of being heard and being responded to in some way. There's deliberative space. This might be quite working space. It might have public elements, it might have private elements. It would be the places where we test reasons, where we give reasons, where we build coalitions around ideas, but sometimes it's just thinking space. Space to think through ideas. And then you might have decision and scrutiny space. I take the view that in a democracy we need single decision spaces, single stages that themselves should be open and accessible, so that the arguments for and against different proposals can be tested in public. This is part of the demand of public reason, that saying something in public has a disciplining force. Some things are simply unsayable in public, and so if you need to defend a position and find you can't look the other in the eyes and say no, then that has a certain moral force, that has a certain moral reigning. I'm running a little low on time, so I won't go into this next thing about what happens when deliberative spaces are separated from decision space. There's some very interesting work being done on the US Capitol about this, about the historicization of the US Capitol, and it's fading into the background as a site for the work of democracy, and its re-emplacement as a sacred site of the American civic religion, to use a term from Robert Bellah. What does this mean? Here's my radical claim. Democracy and active citizenship requires space for the demonstration of the scale of public displeasure. You need large, relatively flat and unimpeded spaces in capital cities, in the sites of public dignity, in the sites of the symbols of national significance, to clothe your demands in those symbols of citizenship and dignity, whatever they happen to be in your particular locality. And it needs to be big enough to be able to gather large numbers of people into that space to demonstrate the scale of public anger. That it's not just the guy saying, I'm so angry I made a sign, but hundreds of thousands, millions of people waving that sign, saying, look. But that the standard injunctions from the social perspective, from this encounters with strangers perspective, fail to provide or support that space. Instead, what you get is this. Some of you may recognize this as Chater Gardens in Hong Kong. Frequently celebrated as public space. It's a particularly quiet day when that photo was taken, but on the weekends this becomes a major site for the gathering of domestic workers in Hong Kong, particularly Filipino domestic workers, and the space just becomes full of people having picnics and so forth. And it's celebrated as a space for a counterpublic, for a despised counterpublic to gather and engage. And that's true, and that's valuable, and that's great, but it also happens to be the largest public space next to the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, which means that people have a gathering point, they have a marching point, and when they get to the Legislative Council, this space will only take about 5,000 people in isolated pockets. You cannot demonstrate the scale of anything in this space, and you don't get the sense of engaging with the powerful. You don't get the sense of coming up and rattling their cages. Now, I'm running very low on time here, so I'm just going to very quickly point out some examples, and perhaps I can talk about some of these things later. But for me then, I was struck yesterday very much by the claim that in Gerald's examples, that there was good public space and bad public space, and for him, the bad public space was relatively open, unprogrammed, uninviting. And yet, for me, from a political point of view, that's precisely the kind of space we need in certain locations for certain purposes, for certain kinds of audiences. And I've got some examples, particularly from the Australian Parliament, which is often sort of held up as this marvel of democratic design. I think is one of the most mendacious democratic buildings in the world, and the same goes for the National Assembly for Wales. I'd like to celebrate Ottawa, Parliament Hill in Ottawa, partly because it's a working space. It has not been historicised. It still functions as a space for protest. You can protest right up to the doors, right up to the main steps, and politicians come out and engage with people. Right there, you get a sense of immediacy. Parliamentarians are the ones who are defending this against the protests of the security forces who want to shut this all down and impose perimeter security. And they say, it's Canadians' parliament. You can't shut this down. It's not yours. It's theirs. And that gives Canadians a sense that that they're not so isolated, that their politicians are listening to them. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much.
If you could leave the lights on, I shudder to think what will happen if I talk about theory and everybody's in the dark. You'll be able to see my pictures, I think. Okay. And was there a magic button to turn it off? The screen? No? Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you, Gerald, for organizing the conference and inviting me. We've already, I think, had some very interesting conversations. I work as an urban sociologist, and when I do that, I try to synthesize theory and the field observations that I've done of New York City public spaces. So I want to use that to talk exactly about how theory might be useful today in the actual production of public space. And I was thinking primarily of three theorists, some of whom have been mentioned already, Henri Lefebvre, David Harvey, and Hakim Bey. Now, Lefebvre, of course, initiated the spatial turn in Marxist theory and was looking at space much the way that Marx had looked at modes of production, that just as each society has a distinctive mode of production, they have a distinctive mode of production of space. And so something like capitalism shapes space physically, conceptually, and symbolically in recognizable ways. Harvey builds on this, right, and argued that different forms of capitalism have shaped space differently so that we can have a neoliberal space, a postmodern space. Hakim Bey, who I hope I'm not offending him, I think is a madman. I think like a generation of contemporary activists was unwilling to wait for the kind of large-scale social revolution that Marxists like Harvey and Lefebvre required. And so he was looking for temporary anarchic manifestations of the revolutionary moment in the present. So Bey pointed to places that were temporarily out of control of the state, anything from pirate hideaways to squats to buildings occupied by protesters. And he called those temporary autonomous zones, places where the normal state-imposed authority didn't apply, where users could experience, if only for a moment, what liberation really tasted like. So there's a problem. These authors are all good for critique, but how can they be used to build? And I think about the perspective of friend and colleague Cynthia Kaufman, who describes herself as a feminist and a Marxist, and says that as a feminist, there are lots of ways that she can work on everyday things and be working on feminism, right? So she can work at a women's center or do abortion clinic defense or work against domestic violence, and she's doing feminism. But it's a lot harder for her to find ways to do Marxism, because most of the things that she can do in the 21st century United States, at least until recently, felt like sort of reformist, liberal distractions from a larger social project. And in her writing, Kaufman has argued that we should be able to find things that are done in the here and now, perhaps at a smaller scale, that count as the sorts of things that would be doing Marxism for her. And in the same way, I think we want to think about ways that Harvey and Lefebvre are useful not just as critique, but in everyday practices. In that respect, Dolores Hayden has certainly been able to do that with feminist theory. I always love this illustration. I grew up in the suburbs, and I remember seeing this in undergrad and realizing that you could take theory and redesign the suburbs I grew up in a radical way. She identifies these sort of series of small-scale changes to suburban developments that could create a more feminist landscape, right? Please, lights on. Honest, I'm not that interesting. So the question is whether these theorists' work include recommendations for the actual real-life production of public space. Most of you have probably seen this before. Haven't this illustration? No? Okay, fine. Turn the lights down for a second. This is great. You've got the classic, lots with the individual houses, and then she sort of walks you through and says, well, if you wanted to, the first thing you could do is make the individual lots smaller and create this shared communal backyard, and that might provide community space and play space for children. And then if you got really ambitious, in the third example, you would introduce a whole bunch of different things, and she suggests that the shared space in the back could have laundry facilities, it could have elder care and daycare centers, you could have food services, you'd have a village green, and this walkway around it, so that without having to bulldoze the entire suburbs, you've created this radically feminist space, in a space that by her analysis, I think correctly, was clearly a sort of patriarchal space that left very little opportunity for women to exercise and oppress them in pretty obvious ways if you've ever had to do a load of laundry. So again, the question is, can we use other sorts of recommendations in real-life production? And I think Gerald's example poses it squarely, that he can imagine giving, or is, I guess, given students this assignment, right, to draw a space inspired by theorists. And take a moment now with your favorite theorist to do that, right? I mean, what would a Lefebvrean space look like? What would a Harvey space look like? And I think that the results are probably dissatisfying, right? And with good reason. And it's a great exercise because it sets the problem up so clearly. But does that mean that our conclusion is that theorists don't matter? Well, I would argue that they do. And so to walk ourselves out of this conundrum, I think it's useful to remember that to Marxist geographers like Harvey and Lefebvre, the point of theory is to illuminate, articulate, and resolve the key conflicts and contradictions in the production of space, right? That they're not useful on that blank sheet of paper that's so terrifying. They're useful in the conflicts of the production of space. So we probably would not find a use for theory in the classroom because there are no social relations of production of space, right? There's no client, there's no owner, there's no developer, there's no local politician, there's no community group. Theory of this sort doesn't tell you what to do in a vacuum, but in relation to others' designs for the space. So there are a couple examples of how spaces, I forgot to start my timer. There, I've got 20 minutes from now. I'll let you all out early, like I say to my students, and then we go over. But theory is illuminating in practice, right? And I think of two examples from my work on the privately owned public spaces that architects gave to me. One is about when the Uris brothers were developing 55 Water Street, which is where the elevated acre you saw pictures of is now. And before it would look like that. It was a horribly barren space. But initially, Larry Halperin had been hired to design the space. And Larry came from the West Coast. Larry was known for his people plazas. And that was his theory of public space. Well, it was not the Uris brothers' theory. And when they saw his designs for a people plaza, Larry was fired. And nobody knew until later that Larry was actually the Urst brothers' first cousin. And so what do we learn from this? That blood is not thicker than theory, right? In another example, the developer, Mel Kaufman, was inspired, supposedly, by a visit to a planning school in the 1960s, where he was exposed to the sorts of ideas that the students were interested in and developed distinctly different spaces. I think, do I have a picture? Yeah, here we go. Some of these classic Mel Kaufman spaces. I was fortunate enough to look at the archives, the William White archives at the Project for Public Space, where Fred Kent is. And when Holly White talked to Mel about some of his spaces, he said that Mel confided in him, as if a great secret, that the spaces, the buildings with these plazas were renting out faster than the competition spaces. And so from this, we see that theory has implications for design, for use, for family, for return on investment, right? So what sorts of conflicts, then, do we want to look at if we want to apply theory? Well, Harvey suggests that we should look at social movements, right, and not at theory. He's discussing the right to the city movement, which was always sort of fascinating to me because it's a term that comes from Lefebvre, and I thought, God, did these community activists actually read through Lefebvre and seize on this idea? And Harvey cautions against, in his analysis, turning to Lefebvre too readily. He says, if over the last decade the idea of the right to the city has undergone a certain revival, then it's not to the intellectual legacy of Lefebvre that we must turn for an explanation, as important as that legacy may be. What's been happening in the streets among urban social movements is far more important. Harvey argues that there is a demand, and then that theory can help us understand how to respond to that demand, how to make something productive out of our own dissatisfaction with things. So I want to consider social movements' relationship to different kinds of space that are implied by these theorists. And to do that, I sort of worked on a typology of space. I've used it in other settings as well, and I think it's appropriate here. Fran Tonkus has a great description of public space that brings us to this sort of continuum or twofold table. She says that while the primary ideal of public space is based on equality of access, the real life of public space suggests that these are not constituted purely in terms of access, but are organized through forms of control and exclusion. And in perhaps dialectical way, I found that understanding space was always useful. It was always useful to look at what you weren't looking for. That if you looked for access, you couldn't understand spaces. But if you looked for exclusion, they started to make sense. I'm not an architectural photographer, but I found that when I took pictures of empty spaces, the photos weren't really useful. But if I had people in them, I could show you how empty they were. If you have one person playing a violin at the top of the 55 watt, you see how vast and empty it is. If there's nobody there, you just say, oh, yeah, nicely built. So what do we get if we have this continuum of control, whether control is more private or public, and then who is excluded, whether everyone is excluded and no one is excluded? And I came up with this working on looking at the privately owned public spaces that Gerald talked about. So the idea that you have a public space from which everyone is excluded is sort of more the norm for the spaces I looked at than the exception. And so I came up with these different typologies, and I want to focus today on the three in white: community spaces, autonomous spaces, and popular spaces, as spaces that have potential for the sorts of social transformation that these theorists are talking about in conflict or dialogue with other sorts of interests. So let's talk about community spaces. Community spaces are places where members of some self-styled community are the ones who control the space. So you can think about a community garden, a street corner in some sort of ethnically homogenous neighborhood, the Knights of Columbus bar out in Gerritsen Beach, Brooklyn. These are all community spaces. They are places where you foster and build community, where community is performed. These are postmodern spaces of identity formation and sometimes of politics. I'll mention with the caveat, I think public space is really dangerous, and community spaces too, that community spaces have an inherently exclusive potential since they rely on this us versus them category. Now, as an example, one of my favorite of community spaces was developed by the Architects Renewal Committee in Harlem. And when the plans came out for the State Office building on 125th Street in Harlem, which is now I think where Bill Clinton's offices are, it was initially a sort of classic tower in the plaza design. And by the time construction came around, the residents were very much in objection to it. And what Arch did was to do exactly what theory should do. It's an example of planners taking this demand, this dissatisfaction, developing it into a plan for the built environment. And what you see is that while as it was built on the right, it's that typical sort of open public plaza, which incidentally is never used. People sort of line the edge along the street, and then the inside is, good for parking alien aircraft or something. On the series of designs that the Architects Renewal Committee did, they were creating not public space, but very conscientiously community space. This was a fairly nationalist phase in the sort of Afrocentric community movement. And so you had these walled off, the sort of street curtain was maintained with buildings. You had a sort of arched entrance that you walked into, and then you had a plaza, which is hard to see in this archival drawing, a plaza on the inside. That entrance was to make clear that it was not public space for everybody. It was community space for members of the Black community, and to be used for the people who are using the spaces inside, right? That were using the daycare center and that sort of thing. So that's community space. Popular space. Here's Boston Common, one of the favorite places to splash around this summer. We can think about Harvey's right to the city here. What does theory propose for design? Well, again, it depends on the social context. In the 1960s, privatized spaces were designed with no amenities and no users. So I think the response was to invest in amenities so that someone could use them. By the 1970s, developers wanted filtering mechanisms to selectively welcome people into shopping mall type spaces. Well, then you have to think about open access and the removal of those filters. If the privatization Parks Conservancy movement is interested in historical renovation to the Olmsted era, I think it's reasonable to start thinking about why you wouldn't do historical renovation to the Moses era or the WPA era. I'm not a Moses booster, but I think that there are some political components to design that are at least worth exploring again. And then we have this autonomous space, right? Which I should say that, autonomous spaces, I can give you a technical definition, but to me it is a visceral experience. If you've ever been in a space that was taken over and the cops can't get there, you feel it in your gut. I get butterflies. And to me it's a moment of great excitement and fear, right? You feel like something really great could happen, or that they're gonna hit you over the head when the cops get back and this is really gonna hurt, right? Again, that there's real danger there. And Occupy Wall Street is clearly an example. During the fall of Occupy Wall Street, I was giving a talk on my book, The Beach Beneath the Streets, on privately owned public spaces and protest movements. And there's a guy in the audience who got really excited to learn that there were POPs along Broadway in the theater district. And he said, this is terrific. We'll have an event called Occupy Broadway. And we'll have 24 hours of live theater. And it'll be fantastic, and no permit. And they did it. Right, at this point, the cops are like, right, we know you get to use these spaces whenever you want, no permits, we're just going to stand here. If you could get away from the fire exit, that would be nice, right? And I have to say, if my little book triggered the takeover and occupation of a corporate office building by theater people, then I think that in favorable social context, theoretical work can clearly create spaces that foster similar sorts of innovative and creative uses of public space. So what are the implications here? I think that there are very different kinds of spaces that we need for organized everyday and political purposes. And in the recent past, each one of these three were vilified, right? Considered the leading threat to elite. So, popular spaces, public parks, were too wild because they were too public. They're too unmanageable, right? We had to replace them with private partnerships because parks were too expensive and they conflicted with the ideology that the public couldn't provide any amenities. It had to be the private sector. Community gardens, right? Community gardens in New York, anyway, became such valuable symbols of non-commodified community that their defense by gardeners stood in the way of gentrifying real estate speculation, right? And Giuliani vilified community gardens. Imagine today that politicians and real estate developers and executives must pine for the good old days when the biggest threat in public space came from people who are tending tomatoes and butterfly plants, right? And then we have Occupy Wall Street's autonomous spaces, right? After 50 years of these unused bonus plazas, we realize that it's not that they don't have a use, that the obvious use is challenging corporate power, right? They just set a stage for that sort of thing. But it means that at each point, some of these were impossible to use. And I think some people have worried that the next round of space is going to clear out the types of spaces that you can use for an Occupy-style occupation, thinking about the new rules, which I'm curious, there are very specific rules about what kinds of signs you can put up, and I'm wondering if they went through the whole process, but that's a separate conversation. But it means that if spaces, for instance, like Zuccotti Park become verboten, I think that what we can do is be adaptive, right? So that if developers are afraid of those mass takeovers, then you can create intimate community spaces. A basketball court in the middle of the central business district is something I've been waiting for a long time, or a playground next to it for a low-income housing project. If you don't want to make office plazas that make it sort of corporate headquarters obvious targets, well, maybe we need to promote payments to develop public parks a few blocks away. Those are still valuable spaces. And I'm not saying that spaces can be designed for so that a protest springs up there, right? I mean, designing public space for its radical potential is like designing an East Coast building for a tornado, right? I mean, you can do it, but it's a low-frequency event, and you're probably not going to get to see it come into the space that you design. Instead, I think that theory and activism tell us that there's not one kind of space, that there are several. And what's interesting is that in my study of bonus plazas around office buildings, I had found over the last 50 years that developers were at the vanguard of new public spaces, right? That they figured it out first. So that gentrifying spaces showed up as early as 1975 at that Citicorp mall. But theorists trailed by almost a whole generation and didn't figure out that gentrification would become such a significant force until later. Today, for the first time, it's conceivable that thanks to these recent protest movements, people armed with radical theory can actually move more quickly and deftly than the structural speculators, the real estate developers, in altering the landscape. And if that's so, then planners and others who are attentive to the current social conflicts and who are concerned with social justice and equality, if those planners, if we're flexible, then theory can help us continue to develop public spaces with insurgent and therefore truly public potential. Thank you.
Thank you all. This was we had a lot of material to discuss. So the plan now is to come up and sit in these comfortable chairs. And I think we can turn the lights on now. We're going to open this up. We have, according to my watch, about 20 minutes. And what I would propose is that we just open it up. And the way that I like to do this is that we actually collect a lot of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the panel and ask them to select which ones they would like to reply to, and maybe we can do a few rounds. So I would just ask if before you ask a question, just a reminder to please kindly identify yourself so that people know who's asking. Yes, thank you.
I'm Barbara Paley, and I'd like you to.
We need mics.
Yes, we do.
Is there a mic? Sorry.
I'll just shout. I'm Barbara Paley.
We're recording, so we can just.
For posterity. You want my mic?
Do we have microphones or?
Here, in the meantime.
So, I'm Barbara Paley. I'd like you to address what's next for Occupy. As I travel around the world, I see all kinds of Occupy movements. What are we thinking of for America and for our democracy and for our privacy?
Okay, let's take a few more. Who else? Yes.
Hold on a
please.
second.
We've got the roving microphone.
This is the task of the conference chair.
Hello. I'm very interested in this topic of the relevance of theory to practice. My name is Gary Demetric, and I'm the president of the Association of Cambridge Neighborhoods. And I find myself in planning discussions all the time, but I don't have any formal training in urban planning. What should I know about this stuff?
Great, thank you very much. Let's maybe take a couple more. Yes, in the middle.
Hi, Damien White, RISD. Just an observation on our second talk by John Parkinson. I'm really struck between a kind of a disconnect between what's actually happening in actual existing democracy in Europe, for example, and how you've envisaged democracy as and democratic space as places where people can encounter. It just seems to me that a reasonable reading of what's going on in Europe requires a kind of post-Fukuyama vision that that liberal democracy might not be the endpoint in history, that there's a profound series of institutional crises occurring at every level that we have nation states like Spain now with nearly a quarter of the population unemployed. We have got political crises in Italy, even Britain, which are systematically raising the question of whether that 1990s liberal vision actually holds water at all. So I think, do we not need to actually open up our accounts of the possibilities of public space, maybe beyond how you were envisaging?
Thank you, Damien. Let's take maybe one or two more. Maybe we should privilege this. We need to sort of have a spatial equilibrium in this room. So we've been privileging the middle. Anyone on the side want to throw something into the mix?
You scared them.
Yeah, we've scared them away. Okay, well then I'll throw something into the mix, which is, sorry, Hank, did you want, no. Oh, you saw one. Well then, please, Ignacio.
Thanks. My name is Ignacio Farias. I had a question about perhaps another tradition of thinking about public spaces. It seems to me that all of those presentations were like focusing very much on claim making, political identities, and so on. There is another sort of way of thinking about public space, which is related more to anonymity, to the right to indifference, not to the right to difference and to express my own identity and my claims, but also the right to indifference, to be anonymous. And this way, is it working? Yeah.
Yes.
And this is not apolitical. This is connected to a different political figure, which are not interest groups or classes or social classes and so on. It is connected to the figure of the mass and the urban masses that act irrationally, that do things that contest morality and do all type of crazy things like burning buildings and so on. So I would like to ask you about this other way of thinking about space as a more, perhaps in the Michel de Certeau kind of way of thinking, a more vectorial space of intensity and so on.
Thank you, Ignacio. So before we turn to the panel, I'll just throw in one other distinction, maybe to clarify, maybe to complicate. We're talking about theory in so many different ways here, and there's at least two layers of this. One layer is theory as a guide to how you design public space, and that's obviously an important layer of all three presentations. But there's another layer of theory in this conversation, which is using theory as a guide to interpreting the broader context within which public space is produced and used. So in other words, theories of capitalism, theories of the state, theories of the public. And both of those are interconnected, but that's at least a distinction. Peter, did you want to come in? Or you're just giving us the mic?
Yep, quickly.
Please.
I'd be interested in any comment on the design of anti-democratic public spaces, for instance, under fascism, and is the difference one of theory or of design?
Yep. Thank you, Peter. So why don't we turn it over to the panel? Thanks, Doug. So I don't know, should we just go, do you want to start, or should we just go this way?
Let me jump in with the Occupy question, because I think that's easier, and John has to save democracy in Europe, so I'm going to give him another 30 seconds. That question, by the way, is terrifying to me. It was really well posed. I see the shadow of Lord knows what. So in terms of the Occupy movement, I think there are a couple things. One, Occupy clearly showed us, as we've been discussing this conference, right, the value of space. And what I think was fascinating was that, people have complained that those issues have been raised before with no attention, and that protests have happened in public space without the same attention. And that I think that the movement captured people's attention in part because they were physically holding space against obvious opposition, right? And that got a level of respect in a way, in a much more important way, that Egypt, the government of Egypt didn't need Tahrir Square to function, right? You can operate the country without that, but the fact that that space was held toppled the government. So I think that that's an interesting indication of the importance of public space in an oppositional way. But having followed these sorts of movements before, in New York, Reclaim the Streets, and elsewhere was a predecessor to these, what happens is, and the movements, the protests against the WTO, shutting down the WTO in Seattle in the late 90s, protesters will come up with a strategy it will work, the police will quickly learn how to prevent it from ever happening again, right? So you get one shot, and then you never get to do that thing again, right? They use preventive arrest or whatever. So it sends the protesters back to the drawing board for, on average, about 10 years before they come up with something good enough to actually seize space. And the Occupy movement continued through the subsequent 2 years, but in smaller protests wasn't able to capture people's imagination. I have a bunch of graduate students who are doing research on Hurricane Sandy right now. And in the Rockaways and the coastal communities of Brooklyn, the Occupy movement, I think, has gotten to the next step. It's not spatial in the same way, it's spatial in a different way, which is that residents in these low-income African-American, middle-income African-American, and sort of white ethnic enclaves of those water areas saw these, sort of anarchist, hippie-ish outsiders show up and greeted them with skepticism, right? And then saw people put their money where their mouth was. And I've had numerous residents from the Rockaways sort of say, look, Occupy, that was all fine. They came, we're very closed off, but they proved themselves. And I think that for the movement, that has been the next point where they are building a series of alternative networks and establishing their bona fides as being people who can actually deliver stuff, right? I mean, the general consensus was they'd work better than the Red Cross, and that FEMA was bringing stuff to them to distribute. And if that's the case, that means that the next step, I mean, they're still, a student of mine is doing a muck out with them this weekend, right? They're still doing physical work there and doing design, so that the next way in which Occupy will interact with space is in the redevelopment of those communities. And I think that their democratic model and the need to think about space leads to some really complicated questions in these communities that are vulnerable, that need to be rebuilt in certain ways. I think that it's been a step forward for the Occupy movement, but the design thing, which so many of you in the room have expertise in, it's going to be a real interesting challenge for them.
Thank you, Greg. John.
Yeah, it's
Easy
solving the
question.
problems of the world in 30 seconds or less. I'm fascinated by Occupy for a couple of reasons, and one of them is to do with their substantive program, which focused very much on procedures. It was a way of making decisions, a way of collective action. But I desperately wanted them to have read their feminist theory from the 1970s, because they made the same mistakes and could have learned from them. They tried to be completely non-hierarchical, completely egalitarian, no substantive commitments in advance, rotating spokespeople. And these are disastrous tactics when you want to engage with an outside public who isn't a true believer, who doesn't understand these modes of operation, with a media who needs a spokesperson with a camera, with a lens that will take one person, that creates media stars who then become resented by the general populace because nobody picked them as the leader. What does she think she's doing, suddenly putting herself forward like this? There's a very familiar path that was trod not just by the women's movement in the 70s, but by workers' cooperatives, going back centuries, right? These are old stories, and so part of me wished that they'd been aware of a greater range of theory, that they'd been aware of a greater range of discussion of these kinds of issues. And I presented, and that's part of my response to the question about liberalism. I mean, I presented one, and a very stripped down, very unnuanced alternative view of public space. Actually, my plea is for more pluralism. My plea is for a greater awareness of the variety of relevant considerations. And some of those are theoretical ones. Some of those are about understanding motivations, understanding political salience, understanding a variety of political concepts, rather than social ones. But then also engaging with people, looking at, observing the world, seeing how people are behaving, not thinking that we can design public space purely in our own heads, sitting in our own drawing boards or in studio, but that we create these designs, we offer them out, and then people use them or abuse them or ignore them as they see fit. I was quite a fan of the my first degree was in English literature and anthropology, and I was, for brief moments, a good post-structuralist, fan of Roland Barthes. And one of the bits that struck me there was the death of the author. The idea that authorial intent only gets you so far in literature, but the same is true in architecture and in planning. You can have all the great intentions of the world, but how are people going to use it? And that's a much more variable thing, and that requires us to be alert to a much greater range of theory and practice. And that's then part of my response to Peter, I guess, is that the buildings designed by dictators are almost never used in the way that the dictators imagine. They're used by dictators when they have the state apparatus to be able to maintain that use. But once those kinds of apparatuses break down, then people start to reuse those spaces in interesting kind of ways. I mean, so one of the examples there, you might say, you know, it's commonly asserted that Haussmann's Paris exists as a means to assert control over the populace of Paris. But it also facilitated May '68. It also facilitated the mass protests, the mass gathering, the mass uprising in '68. So, you know, it's never straightforward. It's never the case that a single form is going to be used in a single way according to its designer's intent. It's always going to be the case that people will reuse in sometimes surprising and creative ways these spaces.
Thank you, John. Adrian.
I'll start with the question about Occupy. I mean, the next move for the Occupy movement, as I understand it, is Debt Strike, which is a project for a debt jubilee, right? A mass movement to default on debt. And I think it's a very interesting and very incisive attack on the privatization of public spaces and institutions over the last 40 years. I think one of the most interesting recent emergences in theory is the focus on debt by people like David Graeber. Maurizio Lazzarato wrote a great book about the rise of indebted man, where we understand neoliberalism as a process of financialization. We should understand it more properly as a process of indebtedness. And what that indebtedness does is it privatizes everything by tying us to the private spaces of our mortgages and homes. And so I think that although Debt Strike is a lot of to the problem of space, where the financial crisis starts with the subprime crisis and the problem of housing and the disappearance of public housing. So I think we can easily tie the current movements of Occupy and Debt Strike also to the problem of public space. I wanted to take up this question of indifference. I mean, I think within my proposal about the paradoxical nature of public space, the paradox of privacy and publicity is one of the ways I'm interested in thinking about publicness. It requires a kind of anonymity or privacy in order for it to function. And obviously we live in a world where privacy is becoming less and less possible in a sense. And what does that mean for different kinds of action? A great example of this for me is the protests against the G20 meeting in Toronto a couple of years ago. There were activists in Guelph, Ontario, who were infiltrated by the local police for a year in advance. The police lived with the activists for a year in advance of the events. And so clearly we need to defend privacy if we're interested at all in the question of publicness. They're in jail. The activists are in jail. And then this question of the two ideas of theory, I wasn't quite exactly sure, but I get the sense you're saying theory is a guide to the production of space, but also the analysis of existing spaces. And I think what I'm interested in with this notion of the paradox is that the paradox is primarily about the articulation of paradox, which can be about articulating the paradox that exists within an existing space, or it can be about trying to design a space that accepts and engages its paradoxical nature. And so I would say the same thing about the fascist space. In general, I think of in the opposition between presentation and representation, fascist space is a pure space of representation, of state power, in a sense. But it can be subverted through people's presentation in that space. It can be activated as public space. So according to my definition, it's just not public. There's no fascist public space as pure space of representation, because I'm only interested in public space in the articulation of its paradoxes. It only appears through the articulation of its paradoxes, whether that's through protest or through design.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So Gerald, we have a question for you, which is a temporal question rather than a spatial one. And that is, should we do another quick round and take 5 more minutes, or should we try to stay on the already slightly delayed schedule? I'm sensitive to the fact that the final panel, given where we started, is not going to end until 6:45 p.m. So I leave that to you.
So I have a theory for that, which is no coffee break for 15 minutes. So we'll capture 15 minutes. So you have 10 more minutes, Neil, with your speakers and with the audience to continue this. And at 11 o'clock, we will resume till 12:30 for panel number 2. And we'll be a little late on lunch, but that's all right.
Okay, so let's do another round then. Yes. Thanks, Doug. We'll pass it around.
I'm Charles McKinney. I'm the urban designer for New York City Parks. I'm very interested in you addressing a very potent question. Would it be possible to have a rule-free public space?
Hi, my name is Ipek Roloff. I'm a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Mount Holyoke College, studying on urban morphology and environmentalism. So my question is about different contexts, different parts of the world. And I know in the world there are regions where urban renewal projects are administered by state, and the state does not care about public space. In fact, it can be very diminishing the public spaces and paradoxes in the favor of manipulating market values for the buildings and consuming market sectors. So what is the hope for those people, those public, to reclaim those public spaces and paradox, including still continue being paradoxical? But then the second question is, how could theory be informed by those kind of anomalies in the world?
Great, thank you. There's actually a question right behind you, Henk.
I was triggered by Greg to, my name is Henk Ovink. I have a long title, so I'll just keep it at that. I'm triggered by the notion of Occupy and its new means on Sandy, as Greg posted. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the innocence of the designer and the design in the process, because we talk about public space as it is, the result and what happens, but before it's there, there's this role. We talk about a dictator, but the designer is part of the process as well. So can you explore a little bit on the role and the innocence or non-innocence of the design?
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, this is probably a question for John and more of a provocation. I guess I really appreciate your plea for organized public space for democracy, but it seems like to me that public space is really space where you don't need explicit permission to be. And when it comes down to the question of democracy, is it really the boundary where the government interacts with this quote-unquote public, which is more important than the boundaries of the space or the qualities of it or the size of it? Because sometimes I feel like it's more important that that structure be disrupted in protest for the expression of democracy than the actual laying out and design of a space given to people to do so.
So let's take maybe 2 more before we go back to the panel. urgently. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sue Burrows. I'm wondering if I could build on the question of the gentleman back there from the Community Neighborhoods Association. I'm not representing a community group of any kind, but I'm interested in the role an uneducated public can bring in the formation of public spaces. If you're not, either as an individual, as a woman yesterday evening was seeking comment on something happening in Cambridge, or as a group, are there, where does the individual's input fit in?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And one more in the back, yes. Great.
Hi, my name is Ethel Sheffer. Here are two possible challenges to two different statements made. One is, and which is this first one, it was also made by Laurie Olin, a designer who wrote about that, and that is, protest is well and good, and constitutionalism and the right to free speech should be defended. Encampment is not. That's an argument in that the encampment even challenges the right to the space, even by those who may agree with the ideology, and therefore prevents the use of the space. So that's one protest. The second one, I think, to Mr. Smith-Simon is that perhaps, and this has also been argued, that the people from Occupy who came out to help those who were devastated by Sandy in Rockaway, and their welcome by the people there, has almost nothing to do with ideology of the occupiers. It has to do with their greater efficiency and their belief that people should help other people. And you could say the same thing about the volunteers in Brooklyn who were more efficient than the government and who were religious. So the question of helping others in this devastation and their welcome may have less to do with ideology than with something else. So it's two different challenges to two different statements that were made by two people on the panel.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. So I would ask each member of the panel to maybe respond for about 2 minutes, give or take, because otherwise we start to spill into the time of the next panel. So let's start with Adrian this time.
Okay, I'm going to just make some general comments that hopefully touch on some of the different questions. There was a question that I don't think I quite got all of your question about the paradox related to market value or speculation in the city. And I think I mentioned both Boris Groys and Hannah Arendt and their claims that capitalist space is generally, it can't be public in the sense that I'm defining public, simply because capitalism is not interested in discourse. Arendt says it's not interested in the public because money overshadows the differences, the subtle differences that are required for publicness. And Groys says that capitalism is a space in which only numbers mean anything. And so there's no argument that can be had under capitalism. There's no discourse that can be had, and therefore things cannot be public. So, I mean, I guess what I was trying to say with that is that neoliberalism has simply exacerbated that fact, and the speculation of the city makes publicness a really difficult thing to produce, in a sense. But this speculation in the city also produces a kind of gentrification, and I also mentioned Kanishka Gunawardena's work on the ideology of space. And I think these areas that are intense spaces of speculation really change the way we understand cities in general. Like, we can walk around cities like Boston, Toronto is a great example to me, and we can feel like in the last 20 years, they've become incredibly rich. Like, people are so well off, and the city is so beautiful, and it has so many new places. But in fact, as I tried to point out with these maps, that's really not the case at the scale of the metropolis. And so I'm saying that these spaces are highly ideological. They change the way we think the city works. The Chinese city is a wonderful example of that. In its massive development, we think that China is always radically transforming towards enrichment, but that's also not the case. So I would say the designer's not innocent because the designer participates in the production of this ideological space and can choose to make spaces which illustrate the paradoxes that underlie the smooth space of ideology. And I think the examples that I tried to show, try to do that in different ways.
I think want to sort of make some general comments that I think are going to touch on several of these. One is about the idea that, perhaps we'll start with the idea of a rule-free space. No, I don't think there's any such thing. I don't think there can be any such thing. I mean, this is again one of the insights from 70s feminism, is that you take away the overt rules and what replaces it is the covert rules, and whose norms are being emplaced, whose norms are being enforced. And it tends to be the usual suspects. It tends to be the people who have power and influence in a society more widely. So feminist groups found that it was the white middle class educated women who were rising to the top and so forth, rather than the full variety of women that they were trying to engage. So for me, there's value in having explicit rules, because that then gives you something that you can engage with, and you can say, well, are these rules the best ones? Are these the ones that we're comfortable with? That gives it gives busy people something to grab hold of. If it's all implicit, if it's all up for grabs, then people don't have the time to engage with these things. They don't have the time to debate every little last detail, and so that then empowers the time rich and disempowers the time poor. I think of sort of riches and poverty, not just in monetary terms, but in time terms as well. And we tend to, a lot of participatory processes empower the time rich. That then has an impact on this, for me, that's, some of the questions were coming from what I think of as quite an individualist starting point. That, am I free to act in certain ways in public space? Am I free to do what I want in public space? And in an urban setting, that just strikes me as self-evidently a problematic starting point, because what I do in a space is going to impact on somebody else. And I need to take that into account. And so there's a lot of debate in democratic theory about whether what we should be doing is thinking of democracy in terms of the aggregate of individual actions and aggregate of individual preferences, or whether we should think about democracy more in terms of coming to collective decisions, debating, deliberating about collective preferences. And that might then create a very different kind of public space. That might create different kinds of citizen who then create different kinds of spaces, who value different kinds of spaces.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap up. If you could give us another bullet point or two, and then Greg has a chance.
It's either going to be a bullet point or a novel, so we'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, John. So Greg, if
I'll
you
try
could
to
also,
hit them quickly. Yeah, in no particular order, starting with the encampment versus speech. I think that those activists have been dissatisfied for a long time that the First Amendment meant that on Saturday you could go and protest in front of the state capitol when nobody was inside of it, and that the expression of First Amendment rights means actually having an effect. And I think encampment does that. There's a longer discussion to be had about encampment, but it's not off the table. In terms of the ideology with Occupy Sandy, I think you're right. What people saw was efficiency and mutual aid, but that is the core ideology of this anarchist movement, right? That mutual aid is the way you should organize things, and that they're more efficient than the state. And it shifted the discussion from a state-centric one, which would have complained that the state response failed, to an anarchist one that presumed the state failed and then took place. And I think that the fact that government hasn't been criticized more for the response is in part because Occupy has framed it in this clearly sort of anarchist way. In terms of a rule-free space, I guess I would agree with John. You can design a park that doesn't have any rules posted, but most rules in any public space are the user-developed and enforced ones. I mean, there are 1 million people at the beach. It's organized not because of the 6 lifeguards in bathing suits, right? They just don't hold down order. And I think that these autonomous spaces are always an interesting example of that because these implicit rules come out. They're not always the usual characters, but it was interesting in Occupy, for instance, to see the organizers realize that they had to come up with rules about drug abuse, right? Because the cops couldn't come in, but they also didn't want people using certain kinds of drugs in the space, and so you develop these implicit rules. So I think you could build a park that had no rules. They wouldn't have your rules, they would just have these implicit rules. I think that there's interesting stuff that you can do with that. And then in terms of the innocence of the designer, I was going to say, Fred was last night sort of blaming designers for lousy public spaces. And I do want to give designers a pass, in that my research found that when you looked at the best and worst public spaces in New York, what was consistent was not the designer, the architects and planners. The same people, literally the same people, designed the best and worst public spaces. What was consistent was who the developer was. And architects can explain to you very clearly and explicitly the instructions they get from developers about what kind of space they want and how that shapes their design. That doesn't, I don't know if there's innocence there, right? There's a degree to which you go along with the program or provide alternatives, and maybe this comes to the question over on the right there about the role for the public. There's the opportunity to, the degree to which you have maneuver, I think, comes from the degree to which you can identify other interest groups that will support other sorts of plans, right? And the degree to which you do that is the degree to which you actually have the capacity to design as opposed to just do what, the Uris brothers asked you to.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much for a very stimulating round of questions. And thanks to Greg, John, and Adrian for setting off the day on a very interesting track. So I think we owe them a round of applause.